Welcome to this month's edition of Info Shield. And of our last edition, we had a few concerns and a few contributions. Please, can we mute our mics? Thank you. And a few contributions, and then we came up with this edition, which is looking at the difference between risk assessment and audit. Case in point is information security, and it is very similar. Doing a risk assessment, so sometimes people mistake a risk assessment for an audit and vice versa. So today I'm here to just demystify both, risk assessment, what it actually means, and then what the audit actually also means. So we're going to just have a brief session. It won't be so long, so we'll have some more time to interact. So now, I had said before in this introduction that both risk assessment and audits, they are vital. They play key roles in maintaining, security compliance. But it also helps when we can understand the two, or the differences between the two. Because if we don't understand the differences properly, then it means that we would end up mixing what or which is what. And that is what we are here to demystify. Sorry, apologies. I'm trying to admit more people into the call. So please just hang for a few seconds. Okay, thank you. So let's go on. Okay, so understanding the distinction would help organizations to implement effective security measures, because if you know the difference between risk assessment and audit, then you know when to do what. So what is audit? This is a systematic evaluation of an organization's information security. First of all, policies, their procedures, and controls. When we say controls, those are the measures that are put in place to mitigate risks or undesired happenings. And then also, audit helps us to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements, standards, and internal policies. I'll give an instance. Before a company is certified to, say, NDPA, which used to be NDPR, that's Data Protection Act. The first, when you meet the requirements, how would the body know that you've met the requirements? There must be an audit, and then that audit would point out if there are things to be done. It will point out the things that need to be done, or it would confirm that your posture is enough to get that certification. When we talk about standards, we're talking things like ISO 27001. When you are implementing them, we have NIST. We have like the NIST cybersecurity framework. And then when we talk of internal policies, companies too also have internal policies, because you cannot run an organization without having your policies in place. So when we talk about internal policies, that's we're talking about the policies within the organization. So the organization can have internal policies surrounding information security, and that has to be met. Then also, it's typically, so we have what we call the internal and external audits. Internal audit, which is first party audit, is done by internal resources of that organization. External audit, so for instance, when we're implementing something like the information security management system, which is ISO 27001, you have you do the internal audit first of all, which tests the posture, tests the, how well the implementation has gone internally. Then you also do the certification audit, which is done by the certification body. So that is an external audit. Then what is risk assessment? Now, what a risk assessment aims to do is to identify, analyze, evaluate potential threats and vulnerabilities. So when you're doing a risk assessment, you're looking for potential threats and how those threats can act. And we know that for a threat to act, there must be a vulnerability. A threat doesn't act on its own. It needs a channel to act, which are called vulnerabilities or loopholes for simpler English. And then also, what it does is to focus on predicting and mitigating security risks. So it says that because this door is open, there's a prediction that if there will be a breach, an authorized person would be able to open the door and go in. However, how do you mitigate this? You put access control, and only people that have had their biometrics registered would be able to enter that, say, server room. And then it also helps in decision making for implementing security control. So when you do your risk analysis, it helps you to decide what controls to put in your information when implementing your information security. We've seen cases where people have, probably even an overkill. They put a lot of things in place, in quotes, but you're putting the wrong controls in place. But when you do a proper risk assessment, it helps you to put the right controls in place. Now, what are the key differences between an audit and risk assessment? First of all, let's start with the purpose. The purpose of an audit is to verify compliance, like I had indicated earlier, while the purpose of a risk assessment is to identify and to mitigate. So you're identifying potential risks and the possible threats, the possible vulnerabilities, the likelihood of those things happening, and if they happen, the impact of those things happening, and then how to mitigate those risks. Then what's the approach? An audit is checklist based, it's formal. So really, in an audit, you have a checklist. You're looking at things and, okay, is the configuration done properly? Are there any open ports on your servers? Just there's a checklist. But a risk assessment is analytical. Of course, you have things to guide you when doing a risk assessment, but it's analytical and proactive, because the idea of risk assessment is to be able to stop something from happening, not following after it has happened. So a risk assessment is proactive and it's analytical. Then what's the scope of an audit? Within things like regulatory and standards compliance, like I said, things like NDPA, GDPR, ISO 27001, which is Information Security Management Systems, or NIST Cybersecurity Framework, all those kind of compliance. Then what's the scope for risk assessment? We are looking for potential threats and the possible vulnerabilities. So, and what's the outcome? The outcome of an audit is an audit report, and then the findings are put there. And the outcome of a risk assessment is a risk mitigation plan. So meaning that after you identify the risks, you have to treat those risks. So you have to come up with a plan, a risk mitigation or a risk treatment plan, to say this is how we intend to treat these risks that have been identified. Now, what's the frequency? Nobody can decide that for an organization, but it should be done, or it is done periodically. It could, a lot of people do annually. If your business entails you to do biannually, by all means do that, but it has to be done periodically, at least annually. However, the risk assessment is like a never-ending story. It's ongoing, because sometimes you need to, based on what you've noticed, sometimes you need to do a risk assessment. You need to do a risk assessment based on what you've noticed sometimes. And unlike the audit that is periodic, a risk assessment is ongoing. Now, who is responsible for audits? We have both external and internal auditors. Like I had said earlier, that with the external audits, third-party audits. So even organizations have sometimes after internally you've done your audit, you've done your work, you get external parties to come and audit. Now, in the case of compliance, in the case of regulations, in the case of wanting to get a certain standard, in this case, ISO 27001, in that case, you would have to, the certification body would have their registered auditors. For instance, that is one of the things I do. I am an auditor for 3 certification bodies when it comes to ISO 27001. So when an organization is seeking for certification, when I'm not implementing, I am auditing on behalf of the certification body. Then the responsibility lies on the security teams and management for the risk assessment. So we had established in the last session that when you're establishing an information security management system, it is first of all a management issue. It is more of a management issue than a technical challenge, because management would give direction. Management will give, policies have to be approved by management. The scope of your information security management systems, how deep it goes, how wide it goes, management has to give that direction. Now, how do you go through an audit process? The first thing you do is to plan, and then you define the scope. So an audit cannot be open-ended. You have to, you could do an information security audit, for instance, in the same organization, but for different audits, you could have different scopes. For instance, you could have the scope for audit 1 could be the entire information security infrastructure and infrastructure. However, you could have the next one, say a year later, but the focusing points could just be certain organs. Okay, we only want to look at certain processes, certain procedures. So you have to define the scope of your audit per time. So if you're having 10 audits, you must define the scope of those 10 audits. One size cannot fit all. And even if it's the same, you still have to indicate that it is the same and spell it out, ABC. Then you gather and you review evidence. Now, what kind of evidences are you gathering? You go, you interview people, you have worksheets, you have procedures, you have different forms, different things, and then you have your policies, you have your procedures, you have all of that, and then observation too. Then you assess compliance with policies and regulations. So something may have been implemented, but the question is, does it align with the policy that is on ground or the regulation that is being adapted? Does it fall in line with it? So it's not good enough to say we have a control or we have things in place. The question is it within scope of what you're trying to comply to or the policies and the regulations that you are trying to speak to? And then you report the findings and you provide recommendations. So after you do all of this, you report your findings and then you put recommendations. Now, what's the risk assessment process? In risk assessment, you first of all, so see here, what you did was to give the scope, gather evidence and all of that. But in risk assessment, the first thing you do is to identify the assets. So what assets are we checking, are we assessing for risks? We're looking at servers, we're looking at, and don't forget, when we say assets, they are not only equipment, even processes. Now, is this process foolproof or does it leave a gap? Will it create lacunas if we follow this process? You need to, you need to assess that too. And then you now assess the vulnerabilities and the impact of those vulnerabilities. So if you say this vulnerability A, what is the impact of the vulnerability? Then you assess it. Then also you now do a prioritization of risk. Now, how do you prioritize risk? Based on the severity. So you always categorize your risks. Now, you could be quantitative or qualitative. Some people would say low, medium, high, severe. Some will say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where 1 is low, 2 is medium, 3 is high, 4 is very high, 5 is severe. But you have to categorize. Then after you do that, you now prioritize your mitigation based on the severity of the potential risk. So you do not, first of all, give more attention to something that is low risk as opposed to something that is maybe very high risk. So after you do your prioritization, then you implement the mitigation strategies that you have identified. So what's the importance of risk assessment and audits in information security? While audits help to maintain accountability and regulatory compliance, risk assessments proactively address security threats even before they materialize. So audits complement risk complements audit, and that helps us to strengthen our security posture even as organizations. So last class, someone asked a question and was like, what's the difference between an audit log and a risk register? An audit log, risk register, he said they seemed similar to him. So one of the promises was that in today's session, we would be able to define and differentiate between the two. Now that we've understood what audit is and what risk assessment is, and where both of them stand and how they complement each other, we would go into audit log and risk register. So an audit log is a chronological record of security relevant activities in an information system. So it's just keeping record of activities that are relevant to our information security. So today there had been a possible intrusion, it keeps the log, or someone, I mean, it could be anything as long as it's related to security, keeping a log of it. And then an audit log provides a detailed history of system events, things like logins, access attempts, and modifications. So I'll explain this. If I'm to do an audit, something happens, maybe there's a funny operation on, say, a server, I would go and pull out the logs. Now, it will show me the system events. It will show me who logged in, what the person did. So for instance, between 12 and 12:03, someone deleted a crucial function of a server and it's affecting operations. I go in and I see that Moses logged in at 1:59 and logged in at 2:04. And it will show me these are the things Moses did. Moses deleted this, it will give you a log of the events and all of that. So that is why audit logs are important. So that way you can put them for your investigative purposes. Then what are audit logs used for? They are used to monitor, and then they're used for forensic investigations, just like what I explained now, and also for compliance. Now, if I want to audit that you're in compliance with, say, policies within the organization, then when I look at the log, I would know from the audit log if you've been doing things as you're supposed to, or you're doing something else, because all the events and logins and all of that, modifications made, it will be stated there. So it means that if, for instance, there's an account that shouldn't have super admin privileges, and it does, when I go in, based on the functions that account is doing, I'll know that that account has the kind of access that it shouldn't have. So what's a risk register? This is a documented record of 1, identified risks, 2, their potential impact, and 3, their mitigation strategies. So you identify, it shows you the risks that have been identified. Then what impacts could this risk have on our organization? And then what strategies are we putting in place to mitigate these risks? Now, also, a risk register focuses on managing and reducing security risks proactively. So remember, we said that risk assessment is a proactive measure so that even before anything happens, we have taken care of it. And then a risk register helps organizations to prioritize and address vulnerabilities effectively. Like we have said, risk assessment, after you've done it, you prioritize your risks by severity. How do you do that? Using the risk register. Now, what are the key differences? What's the purpose of an audit log? Is to track system events. What's the purpose of a risk register? Is to identify and manage risks. What is the approach? An audit is reactive. So I'll give an instance. In 2017, 16, 17, thereabout, where I worked, I remember then they had this, where there was this ransomware, the WannaCry ransomware. And twice the organization was hit. Now, this is because there was a consultant setting up at the time some SAP servers. And we had given our concerns because at the time I was a system administrator, and the servers we handled, we had all security measures in place and all of that. But first of all, these servers were on, the consultant was working on, they were on the public network, and there was no form of security measure, not even as little as security configurations on the servers. And the first time they hit, thankfully, at the time they hit the application server and not the database server, so we could just format it. And then I'm getting somewhere. After those events happened, the CEO now got an auditor to come. So that was a reactive move. If we had done the risk assessment earlier, which would have been proactive, there's no reason why, that would have needed to have happened. So basically, when things happen, you come and you do audits, and then you look at logs and you look at the past action. So it just helps you understand why those things happened, as opposed to risk. The risk register captures, it helps you to plan for the future. So meaning that you identify this risk. Moving forward, how do we mitigate this risk? Do we transfer it? Do we mitigate the risk? Or do we accept the risk? Because you can actually do a risk acceptance too, just depending on the risk appetite of the organization. Now, what's the scope of the audit log? It logs files for analysis, while the risk register is for risk management planning. And then what's the frequency? For audit log, it's a continuous thing. And that's why you have departments like IT audits, and risk in organizations. And then for risk register, periodic updates as needed. So you update your register as the need arises. And then who is responsible for the audit log? IT or security teams. And then you have the risk management teams. In some cases, it just depends on what nomenclature and structure the organization uses. So what's the process for audit log? So you configure your login settings, the indices you want to use, then you capture and store the system events. So on a server, there's a place where you can go and capture the events within the period in question, and then you could store them, turn it into a file, and extract. And then you analyze the logs if there for any anomalies or if there were any security incidents. It will show you on the logs. You would see unexpected shutdown. It will tell you if it was a power issue or whatever, for instance. Then using logs for compliance and forensic investigations. So audit logs are used for forensic investigations and for compliance. Like we had said, earlier. So if I want to be sure that you're in compliance with either a policy or an operation, I will just go to the audit logs and see if you are actually following or doing things the way they should be done. Then the risk register process is you first of all identify potential risks, then you assess impacts and the likelihood of that risk. Meaning, if this risk if this threat goes through, what is the possible impact, and what is the likelihood that this threat can exploit the possible vulnerability. Also, I want to point out that because something has a high likelihood doesn't mean it will have a high impact. Another one could have a low likelihood of occurrence and have high impact. And then also assigning risk owners and mitigation strategies. So when you identify risks and you're treating risks, you always have to assign the risk owners. Someone has to be responsible. So that's why they're called risk owners. And then also it helps you to come up with the best strategies to mitigate those risks. And then also a risk register process where you would review and update the register regularly. So basically, audits and risk assessments serve distinct but complementary functions. Now, an effective security strategy would integrate both compliance and proactive risk management. I'll give you an instance. When you're about to start implementation for the ISO 27001, the first thing you do, because it's risk-based, you do a risk assessment. From that risk assessment, you know what controls to put in place. And then after your implementation, you now do an audit. What does the audit do? The audit is to check the how resilient our information security posture is after implementation. And then organizations should conduct regular audits and continuous risk assessments to safeguard their systems. And then also audit logs and risk registers serve distinct but complementary functions. So an effective security strategy would integrate both to ensure that there's compliance, there's monitoring, and there's the proactive risk management. And then organizations are advised to maintain detailed audit logs and also update their risks regularly. So thank you. Do we have any questions, any interactions?